All right, so as I said, 2020, I went back to being a leftist. My grandpa kind of confused me. Um, my grandpa said that he didn't like Trump because and my grandpa told me he thought that Trump was a leftist. He thought he was just pretending to be conservative, but he thought that he was actually more liberal. But so I was thinking, okay, so my grandpa doesn't like Trump. Okay, so I'll make myself not like Trump, and then that will get my grandpa to like me. And I think Trump's a white supremacist, so I'll be the opposite of a white supremacist. And oh, my grandpa, but my grandpa confused me because he said that like the KKK could be a concession to a work in progress. If blacks are raping white women, then which they were, then my grandpa would say that's a symptom of predator prey software. They weren't in the flow. They didn't have exposure to higher consciousness and teachings and stuff, so they were acting in a predatory way. So then the KKK is a response. But at the same time, my grandpa confused me because he's like, but white supremacy though isn't the flow. But so it could be a KKK could be a response, but still white supremacy isn't the flow, because if you still see whites as superior, then you're still in the illusion that you are a separate body, as opposed to transcending the body to pure awareness to the truth. But like I said, at the time, though, I didn't understand what the flow meant and what pure awareness meant. I thought it was some hippie race mixing thing. So I'm like, okay, so I'll be in the flow then. And the flow's for pure awareness, and the flow is like race mixing and being an anti-white supremacist. So, so there's just an example would be, so when I wrote my Based on True Story book, in my Based on True Story book, I was saying how I didn't understand how my grandpa wasn't for welfare and stuff, because I was like, in my opinion, welfare is being against welfare is just white supremacy, because you want to maintain the white race by not giving, not letting the Latin Americans into America and, other races, and giving them welfare and stuff. I was like, that's white supremacy. But now I realize that that's not white supremacy. That's, the part of the flow would be to acknowledge that there are different people, and to acknowledge that, giving to the, I went back to my Jewish default, and like I said, I wanted the white people to be destroyed. And I thought that was the flow. And I'm like, no, I'm just against white supremacy and I want to give to the poor. No, I really had an agenda. But my agenda was I was a Marxist. I wanted to get the white people to open borders and to give to the people of color, because I wanted the white race destroyed, because I saw the white race as the biggest threat to the Jews. But in my mind, I'm like, no, I don't understand what my grandpa's talking about, that the flow, the transcendence of the ego, how, because like I said, my grandpa said the story of Cain and Abel was about Abel was a pastoralist and Cain was an agriculturalist. Abel was a pastoralist nomad, and I thought that was like the Jews, and Cain kills Abel. And I thought that was like the white people killing the Jews, or the agriculturalists killing the pastoralists, or even you see that in the Rwandan genocide. I guess it was like the Hutus and the Hutus or whatever. Like one of them was agriculturalists and one of them were nomads. And again, you saw the agriculturalists genocided the nomads. But in my mind, I wanted to be like, yeah, the nomads are the good guys, even though it kind of went against my ideas, because remember, it says in the Bible that Abel had faith. But I was always against faith, because I thought that faith was not the flow, because if you have faith and belief, that's faith, but it's not the flow. It's not knowing. So and you see in the Bible, the people who have faith and belief, they end up being killed. Like, like the Roman Empire, like I wanted to say, yeah, the Roman Empire, the Roman commander, he believes in Jesus, but then the Romans end up being destroyed by Christianity. And I was like, but the Jews end up being saved who don't believe, because they sacrificed Jesus, which is representing the transcendence of the self and to knowing. So it's complicated, but like I said, I wanted to invert everything. But I was like, yeah, I don't understand why my grandpa, my grandpa's whole thing of, because my grandpa said when Cain says, I am not my brother's keeper. He says, am I my brother's keeper? And then my grandpa says God doesn't respond. And God actually puts a mark on his forehead, which some people think was a cross. And then he allows Cain to continue with his life. And the mark actually protects Cain. So my grandpa's like, no, God wasn't like, yes, the common interpretation is people say, yes, of course you're your brother's keeper. You should take care of your brother. My grandpa said, no, that's, what my grandpa's trying to say is that's condescending. That's patronizing. To be like, oh, I'm my brother's keeper. I need to take care of my brother. My grandpa said, no, you're not your brother's keeper. You're your brother's brother. And if you're in the flow, taking care of somebody, welfare doesn't necessarily help that person. First off, it can make the person dependent. It can actually hurt the person if you give someone money. And my grandpa said this one thing about like he said it was in terms of like lotteries. He said apparently a lot of people who win lotteries, they end up worse off after the lottery than they were before. And my grandpa said it's because they hadn't certain apprenticeship to money, and they aren't in the flow. They hadn't, like people who, my grandpa said, people who earn money, who work, who do creative projects, who do stuff like that, money can benefit them because they learn how to use money, and they work and they grow and they mature and they develop. And so when they get money, they can benefit from money. But he says someone, if they're poor and they just win the lottery, they end up just doing drugs. They end up just, they don't know what to do with the money, and they end up worse off at the end than they were before the lottery. So then that's my grandpa's thing with welfare too. He's like, just giving people money actually doesn't necessarily help the people. It actually can hurt the people. But again, in my mind, I was like, Grandpa, you can't see that you're just a white supremacist and you don't want to give to the people of color. And, in my mind, I'm like, yeah. And, I was against victim blaming. I'm like, yeah, and you say that, people say that the Latin Americans, I hated the idea that when people would be like, yeah, they were Aztecs and they would sacrifice people and they were bad. And that's why God allowed the Christians to take them over. And I'm like, no, according to my grandpa, and this is what I wanted to believe, my grandpa says that there is no formula for the flow. And my grandpa would say that, people who worship Jesus can get in the flow just as well as Africans who worshiped idols, who worshiped like the African gods. Because my grandpa would say that any ritual can take you out of your thoughts, your habits, your circumstances, your relationships with other people, other things that keep you entwined to the illusion that you're a separate self. And any ritual, even the Aztec rituals of sacrifice, he said that they could have even gotten the flow. So there is no formula for the flow and the transcendence of the ego. And my grandpa would say that the Christians who conquered the Aztecs might have been equally as in the flow as not in the flow as the Aztecs were, or maybe even the Aztecs were more in the flow. We don't know. So I put this in my Based on True Storybook, and I'm like, yeah, you see, my grandpa teaches that, a lot of people want to blame the Aztecs, and it's victim blaming. They say, they say, oh, well, the Indians, Native Americans, they were just as violent as the Europeans, and just the Europeans were better at it. And that's just victim blaming. And it justifies further colonialism, and it justifies, and, the only reason why the Native Americans or the Latin Americans are poor is because, of the colonialism. It's the white man's fault. But, now but when I became more religious, I wanted to victim blame. And when I became more religious later and more of a right winger, I would have been like, yeah, well, maybe the Aztecs were worshiping Satan because, they worshiped Quetzalcoatl, and Quetzalcoatl was the planet Venus. And, but even then though, my grandpa would say though, so what? Someone who worships Satan can get in the flow just as equal as someone who worships Jesus, or someone who worships Allah, or someone who worships Buddha or anything, because my grandpa would say that any ritual, even satanic rituals, at least it takes you outside of yourself and you can get in the flow. And sometimes even a Satanist can get in the flow easier than a religious person, because a Satanist can get himself in trouble more and come to the realization that he is not a self. But again, so I'm capitalizing on this and I'm misusing my grandpa's teachings. The good is bad and the bad is good, because I wanted to destroy the white race and I hated religion. So I'm like, oh yeah, Satanism is just as good. But I didn't really understand my grandpa's teachings. So I'm going to get to how I started to understand my grandpa's teachings later. So at this point, I still don't understand my grandpa's teachings. And I'm like, I'm thinking that my grandpa's a leftist and he's for, against, because he says white supremacy is not the flow. So I'm like, okay, so in my mind, I'm like, okay, so we must be for race mixing. But I didn't realize that race mixing also isn't the flow, because the race mixing can also come from the ego. And you don't know what comes from God and what comes from the self, what comes from the flow and what comes from the self, according to my grandpa. So, if you're race mixing because you want a virtue signal, or because, your society tells you that white people are evil, so you race mix, or because you want to be superior by race mixing, then that's also not the flow. That's also calculative thinking. So I'm thinking that well, if you're just, if you're religious and you're against abortion and you're against pornography, that's because you want to make women into baby makers and you're a white supremacist, really. And so I'm thinking, the way that you prove that you're virtuous and you're actually more in the flow is by race mixing and being for abortion and stuff. But at the same time, I didn't realize, no, that's also not the flow. Neither one is necessarily the flow. But my grandpa said there is no formula to the flow. So anyways, to make a long story short, I was confused, but I went back to my Jewish default of wanting race mixing and wanting to destroy the white race and being anti-Christianity. But again, I misused my grandpa's teachings. So my grandpa, he taught that, so for instance, Dr. Horace said that Paul says, the good I would, I do not, but that which I would not, I end up doing. And it's like I want to mention also the prodigal son. So my grandpa taught me, like, the prodigal son, he goes out and he sins. But then my grandpa said he expanded his awareness and he learned that sinning is not beneficial. So then he went back and he ended up more enriched than the son who stayed. So my grandpa said that's the idea of you want to constantly expand and grow and expand your awareness, right? So in my mind, I'm like, okay, good. Yeah, the good is bad and the bad is good. But so Dr. Horace says, the good I would, I do, or Paul says, the good I would, I do not. That which I would not, I end up doing. So Dr. Horace, my grandpa's teacher, and this was one thing that I read about him. He said, like, an example of this is welfare. So he'd be like, yeah, people want to be good people. And they still believe they're a separate self and they want to please God. And they think that God wants you to give to the poor and stuff. So he says, the people still believe that they're a separate self and that they're pleasing a separate God and that they're, helping the poor, but they're not. So like welfare does not necessarily help the poor. It actually could hurt the poor, and it can, it can have negative effects. So you think you're doing good. The good I would, I do not, but that which I would not, I end up doing. So you really, what you would not is you don't want to hurt people, but you give welfare and then you end up hurting them. So so my grandpa was an Ayn Rand fan, and Ayn Rand was kind of against communism and Marxism because, in that idea, they say, yeah, communism and Marxism brings about more suffering. So, you were trying to do good. I'm going to be a Marxist and I'm going to help people, but you end up actually hurting the people and you hurt everybody and you hurt yourself. But you think you're doing good, you think you're doing good and you think that maybe you're even pleasing God. Like there's communist Christians and they think, yeah, I'm pleasing God by being a communist. But really, it could be extremely selfish. According to Ayn Rand, being selfless could be extremely selfish and very harmful. So, and as my grandpa would even say, he said, sometimes you have to put yourself first before you transcend the self. But I hated that idea because I'm like, Grandpa, you're just a white supremacist. You just don't want to give to the people of color. You just don't want to give. And we should give because we were, the white people, we were colonialists. Again, I see myself as Jewish and that's why I was so into it. I'm like, we the white people, we see ourselves as the good guys, the colonialists, but really we're the bad guys. And we should give to the people who we colonized. And we should, now my grandpa said that there's a higher aspiration behind colonialization in that, even giving everybody Christianity, because my grandpa says, it's an attempt to oneness. And the realization that there is one flow. So making everybody Christian, it's the realization that there is one flow. But also, again, I tried to misutilize his teaching, so I inverted everything. So I'm like, Grandpa, you're just a white supremacist. That's why you don't want to give welfare. That's why you think you're against the whole welfare thing. Now, my grandpa isn't necessarily against welfare. Again, he says if you're in the flow, you can discern when it's appropriate. But I'd be like, you're just a white supremacist. But then I wrote in my Based on True Story book. I tried to, so I basically talked about my grandpa and I was like, I think he's just a white supremacist and, that's why he's against welfare. But then I said, so I took Dr. Horace's teaching and I completely inverted it. I'm like, one way I believe that Dr. Horace's teaching is accurate is that, like Christians tried to colonize and tried to make everybody Christian. But according to my grandpa, the African people and the Latin American people who were worshiping idols, they were just as close. Apparently, they even say that some of the Latin American, some Hindu people went to Latin American temples and they said that they were Shiva temples. It's Shiva temples in Latin America, which means that they were worshiping the god of destruction and worshiping Satan because Satan worships Shiva, Sukracharya, the god of destruction. So that's the way I look at things when I'm more of a right winger and I'm like, okay, well, maybe it was deserved that they were destroyed. But regardless, but even my grandpa would say though, Again, you could worship Satan but still get in the flow. There's no formula for the flow. But but I tried to invert it. I'm like, according to my grandpa, the Africans, their idol worship was just as beneficial as worship of Jesus and Christianity. Either one can get you in the flow. So again, I was anti-white, and I was trying to bolster the colored races and make the white race bad. And I was for welfare, and I just was basically a Marxist. And I had an agenda, but I didn't let anybody know specifically like that I'm anti-white. In my mind, I'm just trying to show my grandpa's teachings, and they're profound teachings, but I'm using them in a way that I'm incorporating them into the dualistic software I had, which was an anti-white, because I saw myself as Jewish and I was anti-white, and I wanted to destroy the white race. I wanted to destroy Christianity. I was a Satanist. I hated, I wanted to destroy the Aryans. And like I said, now I know, according to Hindu mythology, that's what Satan wanted. He was a Dravidian, Shukracharya, the god of Venus. He was a Dravidian, he was for the Dravidians and against the Aryans. And he was against the Brahmin caste, who were the Aryans. But that's the way I was. So I was actually expressing dualistic software, but I didn't realize it. I was thinking that I was in the flow. I was like, because my grandpa was saying that the flow, he's teaching me about the flow, but he didn't teach me well. So I'm confused. I'm like, well, what is the flow? So I'm like, Grandpa, you say that you're in the flow, but you can't see that you're a white supremacist by not wanting welfare. And I was like, so I was a Marxist. I was thinking, like, if you're in the flow, you should want welfare, and you should recognize that welfare actually helps people. And I read this book by these people of color who wrote it. It was some like Indian people of color, I think, and they were talking about how welfare's, it was an anti-right wing book, and they're saying how like welfare is actually really beneficial, and people who get welfare, they don't misuse the money and they don't use it for drugs and stuff. And I told my grandpa about this. My grandpa was like, he didn't say it explicitly, but those people probably have an agenda. But anyways, I had an agenda. My agenda was to destroy the white race. So anyways, I'll get to, so I'll just give some more examples of things that my grandpa taught me that I thought were white supremacists. So like, so I asked my grandpa, like, what he thought about jazz. And my grandpa was like, he didn't really like jazz that much. And in my mind, I was like, oh, so you are a Nazi, because Hitler didn't like jazz, because Hitler said that jazz was black music and Jewish music. And it was sensualism, and it was to kind of denigrate society and to get people, to, again, promote promiscuity, denigrate society, and destroy the white race. And I asked my grandpa, what do you think of jazz music? And he's like, I'm not really a fan of jazz music. But my grandpa did say he likes some blues music because he said it's innovative and shows some creativity and stuff. And, my grandpa played some of these music. He says like playing the music and the creativity can be good, but he said a lot of it is just sensualism and, and it brings you into the body. And then so this is interesting because I started reading this book I listened to this book on Hinduism, and they were saying how the Shiva worshippers did a lot of 4x4 music, which is like rock music and stuff. And the Vishnu worshippers were against it because they said that it gets you tied in samsara. And that's basically what my grandpa was saying, though. So now I understand what my grandpa was saying. But at the time I was like, oh, you're just a white supremacist. I was like, you're just a white supremacist and you're against jazz music, just like Hitler was against jazz music. And then, so like I asked my grandpa too, like, what he thought about the Beatles. And my grandpa was like, he said, I was never a big fan of the Beatles. And I was like, ooh, he's a white supremacist. I knew it. Because the white supremacists, or like the Nazis and the people, they didn't like the Beatles. The white supremacist people didn't like the Beatles because, again, they said it was a communist ploy by the Jews. Even like the Beatles manager was a Jewish guy, but it was a communist ploy because and the Beatles kind of like promoted communism and promoted stuff like that a little bit. But my grandpa was just like, my grandpa said he wasn't a big fan of rock music because my grandpa said the rock music. It's interesting because in Hinduism, like Ravana, his name means screaming, and he was on the side of Shiva and Satan, and he was like, he would probably be into rock music because he screamed a lot, and rock music is a lot of screaming, and it's very tied into the body and sensualism and stuff, right? But my grandpa was like, he's not a big fan of it. My grandpa said, I like Mozart. He said he liked Mozart and like Chopin and these other, basically classical musicians, because my grandpa said their music is very soothing, and it helps you to transcend thoughts, and it doesn't get you so caught up in the self. And thoughts, because thoughts, my grandpa said thoughts are tied to the ego and you want to transcend it. But I'm thinking to myself, you're just a white supremacist. You're just like those people who were against rock music because they thought that it was black music. Because, the Nazis were against rock music and that stuff because they said it was a Jewish black ploy and it was black music. and it was to get the white race destroyed through sensualism and stuff. So I was just like, you're just a white in my mind, I'm like, my grandpa, you're just a white supremacist. And I was like, he just doesn't realize he's a white supremacist. But and I was like, and the reason why he wants to stop the stuff is because, you know, he just wants everyone to be in like to not think, so that they will accept things. And I was a Marxist, and I wanted people to think, and I like rock music because I wanted people to destroy, and I wanted society to be degraded. I wanted everything to be destroyed because I wanted the white race destroyed. So it's ironic because I'm like, my grandpa's just a white supremacist, but I was an anti-white person. And I thought that I was in the flow by being anti-white, because I thought that my grandpa said that white supremacy is not the flow. So I'm like, okay, well, then race mixing is the flow. But I didn't realize that I myself wasn't in the flow. I was still stuck in the ego. So I'll get to this.